We live at a time when the moral lines around war have been so blurred by tribalism and propaganda that Christians who are supposed to be standing for peace or called to be the peacemakers, we're now justifying mass violence so long as it's our team holding the sword. But if Christ is king, then Caesar, no matter what flag we attribute to him, doesn't get a blank check for bloodshed. And just war theory, it isn't a license to kill. It's quite the opposite. It is a moral leash meant to restrain evil and violence. And if we don't apply it equally to everyone, then we're not defending justice. We're just defending empire.
If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I am your host, Jacob Winograd. On today's episode, I want to dive into a topic that has sparked a lot of debate online and a lot of disagreement and a lot of selective moral outrage. And this is going to be a little bit different than usual because I'm actually going to be reading and unpacking a recent article that I wrote for LCI entitled, "Is James Lindsay Right About Just War Theory?" I'm going to kind of read through it line by line, and I'm going to pause and reflect upon certain ideas and expand on them and give more context and unpack why I believe in the consistent application of justice, and especially, when it comes to matters of war, and why I think people like James Lindsay, who have challenged the anti-war, anti-interventionist libertarian perspective, and literally said word for word, he was challenging them. Well, what's your theory of just war? And so we have offered him our, not just our theory, but this is as you'll see, just the historic Christian tradition and doctrine of just war theory. And if we get just war theory wrong, the consequences are severe, because then we're using it as a club rather than as a guiding principle or like a compass. And then we're risking not just bad theology, but as I've said before, bad theology then leads to the justification for mass atrocities and injustice. So let's get into it then. What is just war theory? Just war theory didn't come out of nowhere. It is a deeply Christian tradition rooted in scripture, theology, and moral reasoning. It's not a tribal cudgel. It's a centuries-long effort by Christian thinkers to wrestle with one of the hardest moral questions. When, if ever, is it just to go to war? The earliest form of just war thinking comes from St. Augustine in the 4th through 5th century. And Augustine wasn't some warmonger. He lived through the collapse of Rome, and he was deeply grieved by violence and bloodshed, especially of Christians around him. But he recognized that in a fallen world, justice sometimes requires force. This is important because I think there is somewhat of I don't think they, would have used the word pacifism, but in the early church, a lot of the sentiment against violence and war, it does bolster the pacifist position. And I do even resonate with a lot of, the early church thinkers and their views on violence. And a lot of times the anti-war, anti-interventionist libertarian position that I espouse, that we at LCI espouse, often gets confused for pacifism. And I have to, kind of push back on that and say, no, like maybe compared to the almost anything goes sort of ethos that governments operate under today and throughout history, our position might seem like pacifism. But true pacifism is to reject as so you have like full-blown pacifism, which is to reject all use of force. Then you have like Cody Cook, who's been on the show before, and we've debated pacifism, who will at least offer a modified pacifism where it's the rejection of lethal force, but there can be a use of some defensive force. But the idea of war without lethal force doesn't make sense. So, but yeah, I mean, Augustine is an early church father, and he did recognize the need for protecting. So he laid out a framework for war that was aimed at restoring peace, punishing grave evil. I'm reading from the article again, and punishing. So yeah, war is only just if it's aimed at restoring peace, punishing grave evil, and protecting the innocent, not for conquest and not for pride or for revenge. Now, later, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century expanded and refined this doctrine in his Summa Theologica, organizing it under three key principles. Just authority, only legitimate authorities can declare war. Just cause, there must be real and grave wrong to correct. And right intention, war must aim toward peace and justice, not vengeance or domination. This foundation was built upon by Christian jurists and philosophers throughout the centuries, people like Francisco de Vitoria and Hugo Grotius, who brought these ideas into discussions of international law and ethics. Even Enlightenment thinkers borrowed from this moral tradition to shape what would become modern humanitarian law and rules of war. So the point is, just war theory has Christian origins. It is a deeply moral attempt to restrain evil in a world where evil exists, but that restraint must have a consistent standard that applies to everyone. So what just war requires? So just war isn't, quote, your team good, their team bad, unquote. It's not about justifying people it's about justifying violence for one side and not the other, or just for the people you like. This is about asking hard questions both before and during and after the war. So again, as I already alluded to, the three categories, but we'll list them out again. There's jus ad bellum, justice in going to war. So this is dealing with what is a just cause, who is a legitimate authority, what is the right intention for going to war, making sure that war is the last resort, dealing with proportionality in war, and also gauging if there is a reasonable chance of success. Then we have jus in bello, which is justice during war. And so this is, to make distinctions between combatants and civilians. And again, still dealing with proportionality in the force that's being used. And then post-bellum, justice after war, working towards a lasting peace and not just permanent occupations or temporary ceasefires. Pursue accountability, not impunity. To rebuild what was destroyed. To promote reconciliation, not cycles of violence. So that's all of it listed out. If you're not following all of that, and I mean all of it, then you're not waging a just war. You're just waging war. Now, I'm just realizing that I skipped the preface of this article, so because I want to bring in why I wrote it. So I'm going to read the preface here, which will just work out that I read it out of order. But James Lindsay often warns about the woke right, those aligned with the political right who abandon principle for tribe, trade truth for political advantage, and use the same tactics as the woke left to get there. And I think he's right to be concerned. But the irony is thick, because when he responded to the critics of Israel's war in Gaza by demanding they justify their moral framework against the behavior of Hamas, he wasn't standing up for principle. He was doing exactly what he warns against. To be clear, neither I nor LCI defend Hamas or its atrocities, and Israel has a legitimate right to self-defense. And responding to aggression is compatible with just war theory. But too often people invoke that right while ignoring the rest of what the doctrine requires. That's why it's worth stepping back and clearly defining what just war theory is. So now that's what we've done. So I wanted to go back and talk about Lindsay because, again, I feel like James Lindsay is right to warn us about identity politics and that's an equal danger on the left and the right. But the idea of identity politics is when you abandon your principles for sort of tribal loyalty. And I feel like that's what James Lindsay and a lot of conservatives do when it comes to the subject of Israel, because just war theory would condemn October 7th. Even though we would say that those living in Gaza, and I've talked about this on many podcasts about how I think that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians for decades has been unjust. However, there are a lot of issues with just war theory when it comes to October 7th as a response to what the government of Israel was doing. There was no distinguishing between civilian and state military combatants. And there's also the issue of, is Hamas a just authority, or are they also guilty of evils and atrocities? And so there's no defense of Hamas in this. There's a couple things. There's a defense of the Palestinian people. There's a criticism of the Israeli government, and then there's a call to not engage in tribalism and collective guilt. And Israel is, it's not anti-Semitic just because the country is named Israel. It's still a government. It's still a nation state, and it's still our job as Christians to say that if a government is going to engage in war, then we need to weigh their actions before, during, and after the war to just war theory. And calling people anti-Semitic for doing so is to actually be engaging in, I think, woke right behavior. So again, just war theory didn't come out of nowhere. It's rooted in Scripture, as I've already talked about. Augustine, Aquinas, and there are biblical mandates to protect the innocent, right? So you go read through the Scriptures. There's that Scripture saying, like, if you don't provide for your own family, then you're worse than the unbeliever. And I think God is deeply concerned with matters of justice. We do need to weigh that against things like Romans 12, where God says, "Vengeance is mine," and turning the other cheek. And so there's a clear call for justice, but there's a clear call that, like, Christians have to wrestle with those other passages. And I think the conclusion we've come away with is that, the use of force, both in general and when governments act, it has to be restrained. And that's where I think the principles of proportionality and just war theory come from. You go read Isaiah 1, God says he despises the blood on Israel's hand, even when they were offering sacrifices. So if your worship isn't matched with justice and mercy, God calls it abomination. God is not someone who takes pleasure in blood being spilt, especially blood being spilt in vain and no reason. So war can be a necessary evil at times. And by evil, I mean, like, it's a tragedy, right? Like, we should always be avoiding war at all costs. That's why, war being a last resort is one of the important principles of just war theory. And so you should be, like, war should almost be like I'm trying to think of a example off the top of my head. Think about divorce, right? Like in a marriage, a Christian in a marriage, if you're having issues with your spouse, even if your spouse is unfaithful, man, you should be fighting tooth and nail to defend, to sustain, and even if it's broken, to, if it's possible, restore that covenant relationship with your wife, that covenant you made before God, to stay committed. Even if someone else broke it, your heart should be like, is there a way to fix this, right? Divorce should be like that last option when all options have been exhausted, right? And that's just with the separation of a covenant between man and woman and God, and it's serious, right? Because there can be children involved and all that, but no one's like actual life, and it's not a life or death matter in most cases, whereas war is, right? And often on a wide scale. In war, hundreds or thousands or even hundreds of thousands, millions of people can be their lives can hang in the balance, both in terms of the war itself and the consequences, the long-lasting consequences of war. So we need to be very cautious, I think, is the biblical standard. I think that's what just war theory is aimed at. And this whole idea, about then once you've justified war, it's not about good versus evil, right? And I think this is where so many conservatives and even Christian Zionists go off the rails, because they'll say Hamas is evil, which is true. But then they'll use that to excuse anything Israel does in response. And it's not justice. That's tribal vengeance. Romans 12 doesn't say overcome evil with greater firepower. It says do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So if we're not going to be pacifists, then the only way to read that is to say that you cannot engage in the same evil that you're responding to. This is just me repeating things I've said ad nauseum, but when Hamas kills innocent people in response to what I think is legitimate grievances and claims of injustice, it doesn't matter. They've killed innocent people, and that is evil. The same principle that gets me to condemn Hamas would tell me that when Israel, in responding to injustice, kills innocent people, that is not defensible in just war theory. So I want to get more into that. Has Israel met these standards? I'm reading back from the article again. No. Let's start with jus ad bellum, right? The justice in going to war. Has Israel exhausted peaceful alternatives? No. For decades, it has undermined Palestinian moderates. It has quietly propped up Hamas as a political wedge to divide the Palestinians. It's maintained an ongoing blockade of Gaza. It's expanded settlements in violation of international law, and it's rejected serious peace proposals, both in not just before the war, but even during the war, and has doubled down on their policies. And again, none of this justifies Hamas's actions, but it does call into question the claim that Israel has done everything in its power to avoid war. That's a requirement of just war theory. It's not just a suggestion. When it comes to Justin Bellow, Justice in War, we see that the civilian deaths tolls are in the tens of thousands. Don't give me this grief about it's Hamas's numbers. The Palestinian Health Ministry has a long tradition of numbers being very accurate. They're usually vetted third party by the UN, the Israeli government, and there's never been a case in history where they reported tens of thousands dead or thousands dead, and then the numbers had wild discrepancies, right? There's even a lot of arguments. There's reports from the UN even saying that the numbers are probably, being under reported, right? Because it's hard to catalog deaths when you have, blown up buildings and city blocks. We don't know how many people are, just unaccounted for, bodies disintegrated or trapped under rubble and stuff still that haven't been able to be recovered and identified yet. We have, just satellite surveillance. We have on the ground journalists and whatnot who are reporting about the death toll. So it's not and yeah, some of that death toll is Hamas, but it's clearly also a lot of civilians, including women and children. And so, don't tell me that this is the moral high ground or that this is proportional. It's just not. And it's only a sort of blind, collectivist, tribalist response that would try to say otherwise. Now, it is often argued, I'm reading from the article again, that the Hamas hides among civilians and uses human shields, right? By the way, I forget where this comes from, but there's this thing that the stages of propaganda where the first stage is it's not happening. And then I think it's the second stage, it's okay, it's happening, but it's good. So that's what they do here. They go, the death toll isn't in the tens of thousands of civilians. Then when you push them on that, they go, okay, fine, but it's because Hamas hides among human shields. So it's so first it wasn't happening. Now it is happening, but it's justified. Okay. Well, is it? Let's keep reading from the article. It's argued that Hamas hides among civilians and uses human shields, making civilian casualties unavoidable. Now, while the frequency or degree by which this happens is generally overstated, it is true that this is sometimes the case, and such situations present real challenges, as does all urban welfare. However, just war theory doesn't give a blank check to kill civilians simply because the enemy is immoral or because it is more difficult to fight the enemy while avoiding civilian casualties. The presence of human shields doesn't erase the obligation to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants or to use proportional force. In fact, it heightens the moral responsibility to act with restraint, as well as to avoid war in the first place, right? As Christians, we must remember the words of Paul in Romans 12. We cannot be overcome with evil in our attempt to overcome evil. and to respond to it. And so, listen, I think that there are clear instances where Israel is just blowing up, buildings and, even like targeting like refugee areas and things like that. And they're just like, to say there was human shields in a lot of those instances is greatly exaggerating, or just, lying at that point. There are instances where it can be harder to go after terrorists in urban combat, and there are tunnels and things like that. And I'm not suggesting that there isn't any legitimacy to this argument. But one, you should at the very least, on the instances where there aren't the difficulties, not be opting for mass wanton destruction. And two, there's a couple things here. So first of all, this is kind of like who will pick the cotton with slavery, right? And just a general thing, like without the state, who will do X? And our argument as libertarians is often when you take off the initiation of violence against peaceful people from the table, human innovation actually then comes up with solutions we don't anticipate, right? And so I would say, let's take, intentionally blowing up entire buildings and blocks and figure out other solutions, right? Now, are those solutions always going to be perfect? I think there's a big difference between you're faced with a really hard situation where there are civilians in the line of fire and you do the best you can in the heat of the moment to find a way to take out the combatants while not taking out the civilians, and accidents happen or even like friendly fire happens. Like, I think that is where grace comes in. But again, that's just not what we see. We don't see the IDF doing, and like they'll say, oh, we dropped pamphlets, we made announcements that but where are these people supposed to go? Like, they don't have working roads. The infrastructure is completely destroyed. A lot of them don't have cars. They don't have cars anymore. A lot of them are injured. A lot of them have family members they don't want to leave behind who can't easily travel in war-torn areas. And then where are they going to go that they're safe? Sometimes they're going out. While we have reports where people just leaving their homes get shot at by the IDF or even by Hamas. And so Hamas doesn't get cover for the degree to which they play a role in worsening the situation too. But the point is that, just because you said, well, we warned them, it's like, okay, that doesn't matter. If a maniac came and somebody in this maniac lives in like a homeless shelter or something, comes and kills my wife, I can't warn the homeless shelter. You have, 24 hours to evacuate the homeless shelter, and then I'm going to blow it up. If they don't leave and I blow it up, I'm still guilty of mass murder. So that doesn't work. Just because the enemy is evil. And this is really important, because a lot of times this is painted as like we have to support Israel because it's Western civilization and Western, Christian values against barbarism. I'm sorry, you don't get to do that when you sink to the level of the barbarians. Because you know what, Dave Smith says this best. I don't actually fully agree with him. I'm not a West is best Christian or libertarian, but Dave will have this line where he goes, I'm a Western chauvinist, right? I do think the West is best. And it's because I think the West is best, because I think we're morally superior, that I demand we live up to those standards that we're advocating for that make us morally superior. So, as Romans 12 says, do not be overcome by evil. This is literally well, they did it first. That doesn't matter. That does matter. Just because it's hard, just because the road is narrow, to use a biblical phrase, doesn't mean that you then just to go, oh, Jesus, it's too hard. As Christians, if we're ever before God going, I wanted to do the right thing, but it was just too hard. That is not the Christian path. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard, people. We don't evaluate what is right and wrong by what is easy and convenient. Now, I want to be clear here. This is from the article again. Can Israel respond to Hamas at all then? I'm not saying that because Israel has not exhausted all peaceful alternatives over the years and is not dealing with the war correctly today, that this means that it forfeits the right to self-defense. Responding to an attack like Hamas on October 7th is morally justified, but if Israel wants that response to be truly just, it must also reckon with how its long-term policies, the settlements, the blockades, and political manipulation have fueled the conditions that have led to war. blowback again, right? And just war theory requires more than reactive force. It demands a pursuit of justice that aims towards peace. If Israel continues to treat Palestinians unjustly while responding militarily to Hamas, it not only fails the moral standard, it guarantees the cycle of violence will repeat. I want to be really clear here. Recognizing any nation, including Israel's right to self-defense, does not mean that you rubber stamp every policy they've implemented over the decades. You can, this is, I guess, to libertarians, we can, because some people go too far, right? And they'll even justify Hamas. Well, I'm not here to justify Hamas. Okay, October 7th was not justified. It is understandable from a perspective of blowback, right? I like the comparison to the slave revolt led by John Brown, who led a giant slave insurrection, and he went and killed, and they committed a lot of mass violence against white people. Not justified, but come on, you can look back and sort of understand that when you oppress a people for long enough, they might break free and act out of revenge. When revenge isn't justified, it is an understandable human condition. I'm saying as Christians, maybe we shouldn't be possessed by that. Maybe we're called to be better than that. Again, I keep repeating Romans 12 because I think that is largely informative to Christian ethics, including just war theory. Thomas Jefferson has this really good quote in a letter he wrote about slavery. And he said, "But as it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice in one scale and self-preservation in the other." So, yeah, listen, their actions have consequences, right? Like I said. And what Israel needs to do is stop holding the wolf by the ear and deal with the consequences. Now, while dealing with those consequences, protect innocent people and, deal with Hamas, but stop perpetuating the cycle. You don't get to continue to commit mass violence and to strip the Palestinians of their basic human rights just because you dropped the ball and screwed up. That's not how it works. It's not consistent with just war theory or Christian ethics. It's not consistent with Christian ethics, just war theory, or the supposed Western values that make us superior. Justice can't be selective. What James Lindsay is doing, what many others are doing, is demanding that only Hamas be held to moral standards. But that is not how justice works. You don't get to quote Augustine when you want to condemn terrorism and then ignore him when you want to excuse war crimes. You either believe justice is universal or you don't believe in justice at all. I'm going to repeat that. You either believe justice is universal or you don't believe in justice at all. You don't have to be anti-Israel to say that Israel has violated these principles. America has violated these principles. Just about every nation state that's ever engaged in war in history has violated these principles. Because guess what? We're sinners, and living up to this is hard. But, try not to use an expletive here. Can we at least try? Can we try to live up to these principles instead of going, oh, it's too hard. Let's just kill a bunch of civilians because that's easier. We have to be honest. We have to be consistent. We have to care about morality more than tribal or national loyalty. The Christian and libertarian alternative. From a Christian and I'd say consequently libertarian perspective, I hold two truths together. That nations have a right to self-defense, but that right is not a blank check. It must be exercised with moral restraint, with accountability, with wisdom. Jesus told us to love our enemies. He didn't say to not protect the innocent, but he did say to pursue peace. And that command is not suspended when we're angry or afraid. In fact, that is exactly when we're tested on those principles. As a libertarian, I also know that the state often uses war to expand its power, to mask its failures, and to manufacture consent through fear. And as a Christian, I believe the true battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil. That doesn't mean we never fight, but it means we must never glorify war or let it consume our principles. While I was reading this, I was thinking of an analogy, right? Like when I was reading the command isn't suspended when we're angry or afraid. It's exactly then when we're being tested. I mean, think about like in marriage, right? It's easy to be faithful to your wife when you're with her and you are not tempted by anything. You go on a long business trip, you're alone in your hotel room, or you're at the bar. Oh, now you're being tested, right? And you don't get to go, oh, it was so hard. I'm sorry. Sure, the temptations of the flesh towards lust, towards anger, towards murder, towards greed, towards revenge, towards selfishness. Yes, those are real temptations. Yes, the human condition is very hard to overcome at times. You still don't get a blank check to just because it was hard to resist temptation doesn't, and just because even sometimes circumstances can be hard, doesn't change the universality of Christian ethics and justice. So, all right, let's wrap up here. Closing the article out. The real irony. James Lindsay warns about the woke right, tribalism wrapped in moral rhetoric, sacrificing principle for power. But the irony is that's exactly what he's doing here. Demanding the moral standards only apply to your enemies is the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook. It's not moral clarity, it's moral convenience. And one of the most egregious examples of this is the argument that all Palestinians are complicit or that they elected Hamas so they deserve what they get. That's not just war or Christian reasoning. That's collective punishment. It's explicitly rejected by both Christian moral teaching and just war tradition. Children didn't vote for Hamas. Refugees in camps didn't vote for Hamas. Hamas didn't, again, just to remind you, Hamas didn't even win a majority in any of their districts when they got an election 20 years ago. They haven't had an election in 20 years, people. And are you going to invoke bin Laden logic? Because that's what bin Laden said when he attacked 9/11. You voted in Bill Clinton. You voted in George Bush. Ridiculous. I hate that argument. I hate it. It's collective guilt. It's nonsense. Don't give me that. And many Gazans who did vote, back from the article here, were doing so under nearly 2 decades of constant duress and a broken political system. And I even say here, even then, Hamas didn't win a majority in any district and only gained full control through a show of force. And then there's like people go, what about these polls? And I'm like, sure, yeah, approval polls in a place run by Hamas. I trust those as much as the approval polls of Vladimir Putin in Russia, right? Or the approval polls of, in North Korea, right? I mean, come on. This is just crazy. What about the, compare that to the March of Return. If you don't know what March of Return is, look it up. I've already talked about it. But so back to the article. So yes, James, let's talk about war. I'm not afraid to put up. Here's my theory. It's rooted in scripture, in Christian tradition, in moral philosophy, and in a belief that justice must apply to everyone, even when it's politically inconvenient. The question is, do you still believe in principles, or are you just another partisan demanding that we shut up and fall in line? Because I won't. I'll stand where Christ calls us to stand, for peace, for truth, and for justice that never bends to power. We cannot live in fear. We cannot let fear drive our actions. If we follow Christ and if we take the scriptures seriously, Christ says, if you love me, you'll obey my commands, then we must love our neighbors and our enemies. As Jesus said, it's easy to love those who love you. We must pursue truth and justice that binds all nations, including ours, including Israel. Because if we let tribalism replace truth, if we let fear override faith, then we've already lost the bigger war, the one that's not against flesh and blood. It doesn't matter how many bombs we drop, we won't win that war. That's all I have for you guys for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that this was challenging and convicting, because that's the point, right? Please like, subscribe, and give 5-star reviews for those of you on the audio side. Biblicalanarchypodcast.com if you want to find more and if you want to support the show. And as I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.